We're trying to be so politically correct that we say any way that you want to get to heaven is fine. We're taking the facts of Christ's death, His resurrection, His ascension, of His virgin birth. We're taking the facts of the Gospels and we're interpreting them differently because we don't want to offend anybody, do we? We really don't want to offend anybody. When I first came here in 1999, 13 years ago, some of you guys were still in your diapers at that point, 13 years ago, did a Bible study. And a couple joined the Bible study that sort of were hit and miss here at church. And they were part of the Bible study until we got to some of this idea. And they looked at me and they said, we can't come here anymore. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, we have friends who are Jewish. We have friends who are of another faith, and we don't believe that there's just one way to heaven. We think you can get to heaven lots of different ways. I'm sorry, but this is what Scripture teaches. So this morning I'm saying to you, I know I'm not being politically correct. Some of you may walk out of here and say, oh man, PG sounds pretty rigid, pretty narrow. And yet the reality is, Scripture calls us one way. There's one way. You got it, Cherie. There is the one way. And the Apostle Paul here is talking about the fact that for them, they were the Judaizers. They added things. For us, we have subtracted so much. But Paul also is getting into, and this is something we need to watch out for, in the book of Acts. The book of Acts, on his first missionary journey, before he goes up into the area of Galatia, the different towns that he was at, he ends up on the island of Cyprus. On the island of Cyprus, if you remember the little picture, the island there is in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's all little dots going to Cyprus, and then it goes up into Galatia. He's on the island of Cyprus, and he has an opportunity to talk to the political leader on Cyprus. But there's a Jewish sorcerer. I don't know how those two fit together. To be a Jewish individual, but to be a sorcerer. Whose name was, get this, Bar Jesus. B-A-R, Jesus. Acts 13 tells the whole story. This Jewish sorcerer goes against the Apostle Paul to convince, or tries to convince, the political leader of Cyprus that no, this Christianity business is all washed up, it's all crazy, or yeah, okay, you can accept Christ, but you got to do all these other things also, the additional. And what does the Apostle Paul say to this Bar Jesus, the Jewish sorcerer? He says, you who are full of deceit and fraud, you are the son of the devil, for you are the enemy of all righteousness, and you do not cease to make crooked the straight ways of the Lord. I wonder how many times we as pastors, I wonder how many times all of you as what's called laity do this. The Apostle Paul says that if we are leading somebody astray, we are deceiving them. There is a deception. It said in Galatia that you are so quickly deserting the true gospel. I think somebody at times it's worse people who desert than those who just outright say Christianity is not real. But for somebody who has sat within church, any church, and has said, yes, I believe, and then later on walk away in denial, there's a deception there. The individual that did my ordination service way back in 1988, ordination for pastors, there's a service that goes on, a special worship service, and then there's sermon that takes place, and then the pastor comes up and you lay hands on it. It's called laying, it's the service of ordination. And the individual that did my service of ordination for the sermon, I highly respected her. I really did. She was an awesome pastor. But in the last 24 years, she has turned from seeing Christ as one way to universalism, it's called. Christ as one of the ways, not the way. And I see that as twisting, taking the facts of Scripture and reinterpreting them. A deception. Second thing Paul says is you can be frauds, fakes, in order to be popular. I don't mean to speak against any of our TV evangelists over the last years, but I get the feeling some of them have done what they did to be popular. Even some today I have watched, and then it's like, where is the cross? Or where do you talk about Jesus in your hour worship service that you broadcast? For some, it's a lot of good feeling type stuff. It's interesting, Robert Schuller. Some of you watch Crystal Cathedral Hour of Power sometimes? Some of you, maybe some, maybe not. Okay, if you don't know, he's a Reformed church pastor. And it was interesting, it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that he really started talking about Jesus Christ as the way. He did a lot of possibility or positive thinking stuff. And it's only been the last 20 years that he's getting back to the Scripture from what I see and talking to other pastors who listen, who know him and have worked out at the Crystal Cathedral. The Apostle Paul talks about you can be enemy of righteousness. The Judaizers were disturbing the new Christians. He also says that you're making crooked the gospel. I find this is interesting because he says you make crooked the straight ways of the Lord. In the beginning of the Gospels, God says that he will send the way, or he will send the forerunner for the Messiah, John the Baptist, who will make straight the crooked path. Make straight the crooked path. And what do we tend to do? We tend to make it crooked again. Because we think we need to be politically correct. Again, you may walk out this morning and say, man, it sounds like Greg is just narrow-minded. And if that's the case, yes, that's the case. Then I am narrow-minded. But the reality is, Scripture says there is one way to salvation. Jesus Christ himself says this, "For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, deceive even the elect." Deceive even the elect. Now, I have not read his book. I've heard a lot of press and watched things. Some of you may know the name Rob Bell. Pastor up in Grand Rapids, Granville area, of Mars Hills. It's a huge church. He does the Pneuma videos that our middle school and high school kids have watched. He has just recently written a book in the last few months called Love Wins. Isn't that a great title? Love Wins. He ended up going on the speaking tour, and maybe some of you caught this. He was on MSNBC. And the MSNBC announcer was nailing Rob to the wall. Because in Rob Bell's new book called Love Wins, again, as I said, I haven't read it, I've just heard what other people are talking on both sides about the book. Here's the MSNBC announcer asking Rob Bell, well, in your book Love Wins, you say that in the end, God's love wins over all, so everybody's going to be in heaven. Rob's sort of like, well, yeah, God's love wins over all, yes. And God's love wins over everything. So the announcer on MSNBC said to him, so are you telling me as a pastor and a pastor of a 20,000 member church in Granville, Michigan, that being a Christian or accepting Christ into your life by His grace is irrelevant and immaterial to your eternal standing? And Rob Bell said, no, it's relevant and it's material. And the announcer said, well, wait a minute, you said love wins at the end, that God's love wins at the end. It doesn't matter what we do, that God's love is going to win. So are you saying that is immaterial and irrelevant to accept Christ in your life and to be a Christian? No, I'm not saying that. What you said, and it went on. If you question me, get on YouTube and check out MSNBC with Rob Bell. It goes back and forth for 4 or 5 minutes, and the announcer is just nailing him to the wall.